All right. So Mark starts with Jesus talking about the kingdom. And if you were to go through the whole thing, he kind of hits a climax point at chapter 8, which is where we're going to try to get to. And that's where Peter confesses that he is the Christ. So we're going to be looking at that. And then the tone changes. There's quite a change in Mark from there. And we go all the way to chapter 16 and his death. So Peter confesses. He says back who Jesus is. And over here we have the Roman soldier who also confesses. So again, if I was trying to help you see the whole big picture, that's really what we have. We have in the middle the Jewish one who says, "You are the Messiah." And the Roman soldier says, "Surely this was," do you know what he says? "The Son of God." What did Mark say at the beginning? He's talking about the gospel of who? Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God. And so we have these echoes through the gospel about that. Oh, is that a better one? Oh, thank you. Let's see if that, okay, great. Let's see if that one works. That's great. Okay, so this is probably going to be the hardest thing I ask you to do at this point, because we have to go from chapter 6 all the way to chapter 8, which is a lot. And I just want to say again, I know I'm sort of racing through some of this stuff. It's so frustrating for me not to be able to sink into every story, but I am hoping and trusting that this is a helpful thing for you. So the next thing that happens in chapter 6 is that Jesus goes back to his hometown and he teaches on the Sabbath. And they're astonished, which we've seen already before. They're astonished at his teaching. Again, it has that element of fear, like they don't know what to do with this. But their response is, well, where did this man get these things? I mean, we already know who he is. In fact, he's the son of Mary. And if you know anything, you don't tend to say that somebody's the son of their mother unless one thing. You think that this person is illegitimate. Even if his father was dead, he would have been the son of Joseph. Okay? So the fact that they think they already know him, Mark is telling us about this. Again, there's the sower. He sows the word at the synagogue. But what kind of soil does it fall on? Well, in some ways, it falls mostly on soil that says, no. I already know who you are. I am not going to change my view of you to be willing to receive what you're saying. So it goes on to say Jesus gives them a saying, right? A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and among his relatives and in his own household. I'm on page 12, just in case you don't know where I am. So he gives them a word. Dare I say, a parable. Sorry, I keep going back to that. But he gives them something. In the face of their unbelief, he gives them this parable. I think it's very important that you keep seeing this about Jesus. And then it says that he was unable to do any mighty work. That doesn't mean he couldn't do it because he has no capacity. The reason he couldn't do it is if they're already not believing, will they be helped by seeing anything? No, they won't. They're not in a place where they can hear it. So Jesus' grace to them is to not do a mighty work because it wouldn't help them. They wouldn't hear it. They wouldn't be able to see it. Does that make sense? But he does leave them with something. He leaves them with this parable. So that when he leaves, some of them might say, well, what did he mean by that? Is he saying that he's a prophet? Because we're certainly not showing him any honor. Do you see the point? They have to ruminate about it. They have to think about what he said. At least he's inviting them to. And they might go and ask him for more. So Jesus doesn't leave them with nothing. This is part of what I'm trying to help you to see. Jesus has a word. Sometimes it's a word of warning. Sometimes it's a word of a parable. But he has a word because he wants, wherever these people are, he wants to get them to turn and come to him. And not to remain seeing but not perceiving, hearing but not understanding. So then right after that, he sends out his 12 in pairs. This is on the second half of page 12. He calls them out to go out 2 by 2. He gives them authority over the unclean spirits, charges them to take nothing. Okay, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, except that I want you to notice what he says at the end. First of all, they have to go receiving. They don't, because they're not taking anything, and they have to stay in the house that they're offered. If so-and-so down the street's offering something better, you can't say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I can't stay." No, the main thing I want you to see is if they don't receive you, what does he tell them to do? Shake the dust off your feet. Okay, why? From what I've just said, come on, why? What does that do? Pardon? Say again? That's right, they weren't willing to listen, but why not just leave? Yes! It's a parable! Yes! That's right. They would know what that movement means. It's basically saying, you know, I'm rejecting your rejection. They're shaking, they're doing something public to be seen. So they're bearing witness to their unbelief. That's what they're doing. Part of loving people is to bear witness to their unbelief, to bear witness to their hardness of heart. All right, the next section, which seems a bit strange because they get sent out, and then it looks like Mark decides to take us on a very interesting little side note about what happens to John the Baptist. Because when you get to the end of that section, which is quite long, at the bottom of page 13, verse 30, the apostles return to Jesus. Now they're called apostles because they're the sent out ones, which is what the Greek there means. They return and tell him everything they did. So this middle section of Herod really could be taken completely out, and it wouldn't disturb the flow of the gospel. But Mark has it there for a reason. Why does he have it there? Now, we're not going to look at it very really in any detail. What I think it's there for is to give us an example of the kingdom of this world. We're talking about authority. We're talking about kingdom. Jesus, as the king, has just sent out his followers. We've been watching how he deals with his subjects, with his followers, and how he deals with them when they come back. But now we're going to look at Herod and his kingdom, and how does he deal with things. And Herod deals with things by trying to make sure that he always has everybody happy where he wants them. He ends up making a rash promise to Salome about after her dance. And because he's made this rash promise, he ends up beheading John, even though he loved hearing from John and would often pay attention to him. So we could spend a lot of time looking at what are the motivations for Herod, how does he go about dealing with things, how are his relationships, what are they based on, compared to what we see about Jesus and how he's dealing with things as the true king. All right? So moving on from there, then you have this long, so many different sections here. I don't even know if I can get it all put out in front of myself. So then you have the feeding of the 5,000. The disciples come back, and they can't wait to tell them about it. It's so great. My gosh, you wouldn't believe all the things that happen. So we said, okay, let's get away from everybody. Let's have a little retreat, and we'll go, and we'll have some time to ourselves. But everybody sees them going, and they run around. They run around and get there before they even get there. So great. Here we are. We had this retreat, and everybody else decided to show up. Right? And this story is, to me, another very excellent story of seeing how Jesus works and what kind of response he is looking for from those that are following him. He He's concerned about the fact that people haven't eaten. He tells the disciples they need to, that he wants them to feed everybody. He gives a word again, right? He gives a word. How are they going to respond to that word? Well, they first of all say, we don't have that kind of money. Do you know how much do you know what it costs to feed this many people? We don't have that, right? So Jesus could just say, oh, I don't even know why I keep bothering with you guys. Forget it. I'll just do this myself. I'll find somebody else. He doesn't say that. And he doesn't say, one of these days, I'm not going to be here anymore. And you're going to have to figure out how to do this on your own. So I'm just going to sit over here and leave you to it. He says, well, what do you have? Go and see, right? And the disciples' response, what's their response? Their response is either going to be, this is so stupid. How much do we have? 5 loaves, 2 fish? Let's just tell them we don't have anything. It's really, I'm so embarrassed. It'd be like my coming here and for lunch saying, I have 2 Ritz crackers. How about that? Or they could just say, this is my favorite idea, is they say, John, go ask him one of his, your theological questions. You know how he always loves to go on and on and on. You get him distracted. The rest of us will run to town, see what we can get together, because this is pathetic. We will see if we have a little bit more to impress him with. But they don't say that either. They give him what they have. In other words, what is this showing us about what it means to trust Jesus? We trust him with what we have. We don't trust him with what we don't have. We can't because we don't have it, right? We trust him with what we have, as inadequate, as paltry, as silly as it may seem. And Jesus shows them his relationship with the Father. He hands it back to them, right? You guys know the story. And they see him being able to offer so much more. The important point to see at the end of the story is he tells us that they were satisfied, sated. In other words, everybody went away having had their fill. And the second thing is there were leftovers. Why do I tell you that? Because it's going to come up again. So we got to kind of keep an eye on that part. All right, how about if you already did. So good, thank you. All right, so this, I tried to create a table of what happens from the feeding of the 5,000 up to the section that we're going to study at the end. Because again, as you work your way through it, you start seeing there's some repetition that seems to be happening here. So we have the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus has compassion on them. Because they're like sheep without a shepherd. They have 12 baskets left over. Right after that, he gets them into a boat, dismisses the crowd, and he goes up to pray, and they're having trouble rowing, right? And so Jesus waits for several hours. He comes out in the middle of the night or in the morning, early morning. And what the text says is that the disciples are utterly astounded. First of all, the way the English translation has it is that he meant to pass by them. Let me just say a little bit about this particular story. Jesus is coming to them. When it says he meant to pass by them, it doesn't mean I'm just walking by. Oh, hon, I just meant to pass by you. Don't mind me. I'm just coming through here. It's really meant. Oh, let me go back. Too many things here. It's too hard. Sitting out in the wilderness, getting fed with bread. Any bells go off? Where else would they have had bread? Wilderness. Exodus, exactly. One of the interesting things at that time, there would be various messianic figures who would rise up to try to get followers, and they would head out into the wilderness. This was actually something that happened more than once at that time. Jesus is in the wilderness. So part of it is, what is he revealing about who he is? He's trying to help them make a connection with what happened in the Old Testament. I am the one who provides bread in the wilderness, right? Okay, so now they're out in the, let's just actually take a look at it. It might be a little easier. This is at the bottom of page 14. So he dismisses the crowd. He takes leave. He goes up to pray. He sees they're having trouble, so he waits. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw he was walking on the sea, they thought he was a ghost, and they cried out. For they all saw him, and they were terrified. But immediately he spoke, and he said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." He gets in the boat, the wind ceases, and they are utterly astounded. Now, Mark makes this kind of enigmatic statement. He says, they are absolutely astounded. Why? Because they didn't understand about the loaves. It's like, yeah, I'm not sure I get that connection either. What are you talking? What are you talking about? What do the loaves have to do with this? So you have to kind of work your way back. There's a couple things that you would need to know in terms of the background that might help you. Hold on. I need to go and make sure I can look at my notes about this. Darn, I can't find it in here. Anyway, basically the idea, he meant to pass by them in a very similar way to God passing by Moses. It's the same phrase that's used in the Greek Old Testament. Jesus is doing a theophany. He is showing them himself by passing by. So the Greek would give you, and would certainly give the early readers, this is one of the times you need that, a greater sense of what is going on. Jesus is showing himself as Lord of the sea. It's really what he's doing. And because they didn't understand about the loaves, they didn't make that connection that Jesus is able to feed in the wilderness, not just because he happens to be a really amazing magician, but because he's God, the God of the Old Testament, come in flesh. They're still slowly getting it, but their hearts were hard. They weren't receiving that right then. They weren't paying attention. Maybe they were too tired. Maybe they were too busy dealing with picking up the loaves, but they weren't reflecting on, what did I just learn about Jesus? So when he comes out, when he walks on the water, they're totally terrified rather than able to have some sense of what happened. Now, he's not upset with them about it. That's not the point. The point isn't to say, gosh, I can't believe the disciples didn't get it. Oh, come on, seriously? I mean, how often do we not get it? I don't get it. I kind of understand that the disciples wouldn't get it. But the point that Mark is making is that Jesus is continually revealing even more about who he is to them as followers. Does that make sense? And they have to continue to have their paradigm shifted. Okay, so then they go across, and people come, and they bring all kinds of people for healing. We're not going to spend any time on that. We're going to go down to chapter 7. The Pharisees then gather around him. So he has a confrontation with the Pharisees. That's the one I really was going to go down to next to. And Jesus, that's a very long section, but basically Jesus talks about what comes out of the heart of a person. What makes somebody unclean? You know, you guys have gotten so wrapped up in what's unclean is out here, things that I can control, things I can deal with. No, what makes you unclean is your twisted heart. That's what makes you unclean. So he is pressing with the Pharisees into what's the real issue of what it means to know me. And it's not primarily just that you're able to keep all your bowls and dishes clean. It has to do with having something inside that's completely messed up being cleaned up. And then we had the Syrophoenician woman, which I'm not going to be able to deal with at this point, but that would also fit in with this whole idea of what does it mean to hear God give a word and continue to move, or Jesus continue to move towards him with trust. The last one is in 7:31 to 37, he heals a deaf and mute man. Now this is a very interesting story because Mark gives us so many details. He takes the man out of town like this, okay? He spits and he touches the man's lips and he puts his fingers in his ears. And at first you might be thinking, oh, that's just so unsanitary. Why is he telling us that? Well, if you are deaf, what's going to help you know what's going on? Touch, right? I mean, if he's taking the time to do these things, oh, maybe I don't know who this guy is, but maybe he's doing something here with my being deaf and mute. And everybody basically is astonished, as it says, beyond measure. And they say, he does everything well. It's amazing what this man is able to do to heal this deaf and mute man. Right after that, we have the feeding of the 4,000. This is out more in Gentile territory. And once again, the disciples still aren't quite, it worked in the Jewish territory, but I'm not sure about the Gentile territory. So they're having, again, trouble with, how are we going to do this? I don't see how you can manage this. Let me find what page I'm on. Yes, this time he's compassionate about the fact that they're hungry, and they say in verse 5 of chapter 8, I'm on 17, how can we feed these people with bread here in the desert? I don't know, we've done it before. I think we can manage. How many loaves do you have? 7. So he directs everybody to sit down again. And they have a few small fish. So they go through the whole thing again. And this time we're told that they pick up 7 baskets, right? Okay, so we'll slow down a little bit on page 18 here. So then verse 11, the Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking a sign from heaven to test him. Yes.
When he fed Jews, there were 12 baskets left.
Right.
When he fed Gentiles, there were 7.
Right.
Is there a message in that number?
Well, actually, I wasn't going to say this, but there's an interesting detail about that. The word basket's a different word for each one. So the word basket in the feeding of the 5,000 is the personal pouch that you would have on you. So each of the 12, I guess, collected food left. The word for basket the second time is a large basket. Not the personal one that you had. So it actually would be hard to be able to compare the two because the containers would be very different. So, okay, he sighed deeply in his spirit. Wow. And he says, why does this generation seek a sign? Truly, I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. Again, very small story, but Mark includes it here, considers it an important part of what he's up to. The Pharisees have already had a confrontation with him after the feeding of the 5,000. Now we have another one. This time they're demanding a sign. And I want you to take some time to think about this, because this is really interesting to me. We so often feel like if we could just say enough, people would become Christians. It's always up to us, If we just said it nice, if we smiled more, maybe we were better looking. I don't know what it is, but somehow we need to keep doing things. And I know some people who are talk about loving other people, and they start finding, I keep loving them, I keep doing things for them, and they seem to just be asking for more from me rather than actually turning to Jesus. But I know I'm supposed to love them, so maybe if I just love them a little more, maybe it'll finally work. Here's a really fascinating story. Jesus has these people coming up and they say, show us a sign. And Jesus says, no, I'm not going to show you a sign. So from what we've seen so far, why do you think that is the case? What does this tell us about Jesus and how he's dealing with the Pharisees? And why are they asking for a sign? Are there times when people ask for something and it's really not the best thing, the most loving thing you can do to them is say no? Is that possible?
Yes.
So what's going on? Why does Jesus refuse? I mean, maybe there was somebody there who this time would turn if he just did it. What would Jesus giving them a sign when they ask for it? How would that affect their relationship with him, what little they have? It puts them in control, absolutely. Jesus, if you just jump a little higher, then I'll believe you. Jesus, if you just come into my room tonight and write on my wall, then I'll believe you. Just put something on the mirror, a sticky note would be nice. Then I'll see. What we want to do is we want to set the parameters, and we feel so good about it. I'm not asking for much, just asking for a sign. Don't you care? Don't you want me to trust you? Are you really going to trust me if I do everything you want? I don't think so. So Jesus says, no, I am not going to.
You made a lot of signs in the synagogue in front of whatever gospel.
And they've already seen, I know, exactly. But see, they want one now. It's like, yeah, you've done that. But see, that's where you really see it. Has he really done nothing so far? It was familiar with the Old Testament story. Go ahead. Oh, the fleece with Gideon. Yes, I know. I love the story of Gideon. It just cracks me up. Oh, that was good, God. How about if you reverse it this time? No. Right. Okay, so here's a great section. Verse 14. Mark starts off the story by letting us know now they had forgotten to bring bread. Because you need to know this in order to get the story. They only had one loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, Jesus cautioned them, saying, watch out. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Do you see these are the same words from the parable, right? Don't you see, perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? They said to him, 12. I like that he asks a question they can answer. That helps. And the 7 for the 4,000. How many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said, 7. And he said, do you not yet understand? Okay, so even here, there is somewhat of a parable. Jesus is trying to help them learn, but the way he has to help them learn is to get them to keep moving forward. We want to make Scripture so easy to get. It's just a matter of a few things and we're done. It's hard, isn't it? It's supposed to be, because we're wrestling with the reality of all things. We are wrestling with someone who is so far beyond us. And that's okay. So Jesus is attempting to get them to think. He wants them to think about what he's been up to. So he's warning them about this leaven. And we could spend more time talking about, well, what is the leaven of the Pharisees? We've seen part of it is, I put a line, I said, just jump across this line for me, Jesus. Okay, that was good. Now jump across this line for me. Then maybe I will believe. And of course, the leaven of Herod, we've just heard about Herod if we had taken more time on it. And basically the manipulative ways that everybody deals with everybody else in that story, attempting to have power over one another. What do you think is the connection on the loaves? What is Jesus trying to get at? He's getting them to focus on that I've provided more than enough. How does focusing on that help them guard against the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod? Think about it. I know it's late. Oh, she's got to be kidding.
It could be that the Pharisees was questioning who he is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yes. Right. And in questioning who he is, they're busy questioning who he is, so they're not really paying attention to all the signs they've been given. Right? They've been given enough that would help them be able to move forward, to have some sense of who he is. But instead of being willing to receive what they have heard from him, they again want to stay in, they're going to control how they know Jesus or not know Jesus. They're going to judge Jesus, and they question. Right. Are you going to say something? Yes, they have their own agenda. That's right. How does knowing how much is left over in the feeding deal with that? Who is the person I'm following? What's he saying? Who am I? What kind of God, what kind of Messiah, what kind of person am I? What do you know about me? It's interesting that the main thing he wants them to focus on is how much more was left over than you even needed. Why? What does that tell us about this king? How he uses his authority? He is more than enough. He is more than enough. Now, if I grabbed a hold of that fact that he was more than enough, how would that help me guard against the Pharisees and Herod's leaven? Do I need to be in control when I'm following a God who is more than enough?
No.
Right. Do I need to set the agenda? Do I need to tell him where to go?
No.
When I see what he is capable of? No, I don't. That's what Jesus is trying to... So in trying to feed their faith, he turns their attention to what he has been doing and helps them interpret it. What did I just do? And you're sitting, and that's the funny thing is, and you guys are discussing that you have no bread. Really? But we do that. See, again, if I was, in terms of trying to help us apply, have you guys found how quickly you forget Jesus' faithfulness? I mean, it doesn't even take me a full day. Yeah, you were fine there, but this is different. This time, you can't come through. This time, you won't provide more than enough. And so what does Jesus say to us? Look, when we went through this, did I provide for you? Why are you worried about your bread in the boat? What is going on here? Do you see the point in that? All right, so then the next story after that is they go to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and he led him out of the village. So this is starting to sound very similar to the story of the deaf and mute man, okay? And when he had spit on his eyes and laid hands on him, he asked him, do you see anything? And he said, I see people, but they look like trees walking. I see something. This is what I see. So Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. And his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And Jesus said, don't even enter the village. This is another very unusual healing, isn't it? Kind of this weird two-stage thing. What's going on here? All right, let's see if we can pull this all together. You have the feeding of the 5,000, and it ends up with the healing of the deaf and mute man that Jesus does, right? He takes this guy aside and he heals him. You have the feeding of the 4,000, and you end with this healing of the blind man. The blind man sees, but he doesn't perceive. So Jesus heals him further, so he not only sees, but he perceives. Jesus has been saying to them, do you see but not perceive? Do you hear but not understand? Well, where do we have to go even to learn how to hear, to have the capacity to hear and see? Jesus. Jesus. That's right. Can Jesus enable us to see?
Yes.
Can Jesus enable us to hear?
Yes.
Right? I mean, isn't this the point that Mark is getting to by pulling this all together? You don't understand? No problem. Come to Jesus. You don't fully see it? No problem. Come to Jesus. Whatever you do, don't take the fact that you don't get it as a reason not to come to Jesus. That's the main point. Don't let your circumstances or your questions or your doubts or your struggles keep you from coming to Jesus, because he's capable even of healing a deaf man and a blind man. All right? Now, one more thing to notice in this. At the end of the healing of the deaf man, they are astonished beyond measure, and they say, he does everything well. At the end of the healing of the blind man, notice there's no response given. Okay? Why is that? Because I think the response is about to come, is the reason. So for our last study, what I'm going to have you look at is chapter 8, verse 27 to 9:1. This is the section, as I was saying, of Peter's confession, where we go here. And once again, I want you to talk in your small groups, just, with a group of 4 or 5, to notice your observations, see if you can see this in the context of everything that we've seen already. This is a passage that's so familiar because it often gets preached kind of on its own. I want you to see it in its context this time, okay? So take some time to work on that. You can get up and stretch too if you want to. I'll give you to 5 o'clock.